Hey, gorgeous, and welcome to this episode of the Magnetic Woman Show. I'm your host, Lauren Joyce, and today I want to talk about how there would be no Christianity if it was not for Mary Magdalene, and even more importantly, the entire story of death and resurrection is the story of the sacred feminine, and the church just stole it. So, if you don't know me or you haven't been here very long, I grew up Catholic. I went through 10 years of Catholic school. Now, my home, like my parents were not very religious. So I did not grow up in this like militant religious household. And when you go to Catholic school, religion, catechism class is a class that you take every single day, just like math, science, English, religion class, right? So I feel very solid in my knowledge about Christianity and more specifically Catholicism, the original Christianity. And I have spent over the past decade deconstructing religion on my own spiritual journey of becoming a Magdalene priestess, on the path of the sacred feminine. And I, again, have spent so much time studying religion, studying Christianity, specifically Catholicism, and unlearning from Catholicism. So, just to give you like a little bit of a history lesson here, a little bit of a background. When Jesus lived and then he was crucified by the Roman Empire for being a radical, preaching equality, preaching about social justice, and he was Jewish. He was a Jewish man. His followers were mainly Jewish. After his death, for the next 300 years, there were many splinter groups of people who followed this spiritual path that Jesus laid out. Jesus did not come to start a religion, okay? And within these splinter groups, they believed various different things. They followed different texts. So, what we know of as the Bible, and more specifically the New Testament and the Gospels, is a fraction of what was out there and available. And then, and these splinter groups are out there preaching and ministering. What you have to understand again about like the core spiritual message from Jesus and then these splinter groups was equality. Now, this was very bad and dangerous for the Roman Empire because the entirety of the Roman Empire is built on this hierarchy, this deep patriarchal hierarchical structure. I remember when I went to visit Rome a few years ago and um, I was on a tour of the Colosseum, and as we're walking through the Colosseum, our tour guide points us to the five different levels of the Colosseum. And he says, the first level was the emperor and basically like his posse. Then you have the like aristocracy. Then you have the merchants. Okay, so we're on level three. Then you have the slaves, and then you have women. And he said the reason why the slaves were on a lower level, essentially had a better view, is because they wanted to make sure the slaves did not revolt. And so they were basically like, see, you're better than women. Okay, so this is the framework that we're working with. And because there is now this new spiritual wave that's taking off, that's preaching equality, that's preaching like this hierarchy is not okay. Emperor Constantine saw these this spiritual vein, if you will, really becoming popular with peasants, slaves, and women, the groups that they did not want to have power. And so he was like, you know what? Instead of trying to squash all these little splinter groups, what if we make Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire? So before Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire in the 300s because of Emperor Constantine, you have this polytheistic society. You have many different gods and goddesses, right? So he's like, you know what? And then, of course, it's veiled in that he had a vision thing. So Emperor Constantine's like, we're making Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire. So what I'm going to do is gather a bunch of men to decide what is the real Christianity, right? This is the beginning of the Catholic Church. And of course, what do? They take spiritual practices and principles that Jesus was teaching, that you're seeing through the Roman Empire, that you're seeing with other um, different like ethnic groups, and they impose the Roman hierarchy of power and these over these spiritual practices. And they're like, that's the church, okay? And then, the church continues on. And then in the 1500s, you have the Protestant Reformation, where you have a bunch of people that are like, okay, Rome's corrupt, so we're going to break off. And that those people that have broken off and continue to break off, that's where we see like evangelicals and Christian nationalism. Um, so they are a splinter group of Catholicism, essentially. Okay. Now that we're caught up on the history lesson, what we have to understand is prior to Christianity becoming the religion, so in the 300s, across the world, and for thousands and thousands of years prior to that, we have story after story after story of goddesses who died and were reborn, right? We have Persephone that descends into the underworld. We have Inanna who descends into the underworld, who is stripped, who's left hanging on a meat hook for, you guessed it, 3 days, and then she rises back up. You have Isis. Now, her husband is the one that's broken into a million pieces, but she gathers them and breathes life into it for the resurrection, right? So the resurrection was always related to the feminine. And the reason why this is because ancient cultures and societies understood and realized that it is the woman, it is the feminine that is the giver of life. They're there at the beginning and at the end. Our menstrual cycle is a cycle of death and rebirth, right? The shedding and then the newness. It's in nature. And so fast forward to Jesus's crucifixion. He's crucified. And what happens? The men flee. They're terrified that they're next. They're afraid that if they stick around, the Roman Empire is going to crucify them as well. So, how do we know Jesus resurrected? Mary Magdalene. Now, in the 500s, you have a pope who decides to give a homily demonizing Mary Magdalene and saying that she's a prostitute, saying that she's a whore, she's like the sinner of sins, right? Not true at all. But not only is it not true, without her, without Mary Magdalene going to the tomb on the third day to prepare the body, without her priestessing, they call Jesus the anointed one. Guess who fucking anointed her? Mary Magdalene, who is a priestess, ironically, an Isis lineage priestess, right? Okay, are we seeing these red threads here? She is the one that witnesses the resurrection. She is the one that goes back and tells the other apostles, the men. The entirety of Christianity is built upon the death and resurrection of Jesus. That is the point of Easter. Good Friday happens and it marks the death of Jesus, and 3 days later, on Easter Sunday, he rises from the dead. If it was not for Mary Magdalene, there would be no Christianity. There would be nothing, right? Now, obviously, Constantine created a lot of Christianity to maintain power in the Roman Empire, but that's the seeds that he drew on, well, really extracted from, would have not existed if it was not for Mary Magdalene. And yet, the Catholic Church, the Christian sects that broke off, have demonized women, say women should not be in leadership. There's been all these misogynistic men, Paul, Augustine coming in talking about women's roles in the church, when the truth of the matter is women have always been and always will be the spiritual leaders of humanity. And Mary Magdalene was the embodiment of that. She was a priestess. She was wealthy. She was Jesus's sugar mama. She, after he died, went on to live another at least 30 years in the south of France and ministered, spread her this spiritual wisdom of Jesus and herself. So they're seen as, divine counterparts. Frankly, I think to a large degree, it was her. She was actually the spiritual leader. And it was more accepted coming from a man's mouth, right? I personally don't see them as this like sacred union, beloved equal. I think it's the feminine that is the spiritual leader. And I kind of feel like he was there just to be the mouthpiece. Just my opinion. Anyways, she went on to minister about their spiritual beliefs for another 30 years. How long did Jesus minister? 3 years. Okay, so we have this entire religion built upon a man performing miracles, ministering for 3 years. Now, the irony is not lost on me that when men perform miracles, they're seen as some kind of prophet or the son of God. And when women perform miracles, they're labeled as a witch and killed. Okay, she continued to priestess for another 30 years. Again, if she did not witness the resurrection, there would be no Christianity. But the witnessing of the resurrection is the sacred feminine. It is deeply and profoundly the sacred feminine. And this is why I have found so many women over the last few years being really drawn to Mary Magdalene. Now, when I first started to learn that Mary Magdalene was a priestess and then was in meditation and she came to me, this was over 10 years ago. Okay. The information about Mary Magdalene that is out now was not out back then. It was not out. Like, I think I can count on one hand the number of books about Mary Magdalene that were available when I first started to work with Mary Magdalene, when I first felt drawn to her. Okay, now we have so much. And that's for a reason. The sacred feminine, I believe, is really reclaiming its spiritual leadership in a huge way. The witches, the priestesses, the mystics. And with that reclamation has to be a reclamation of all of the things that have been assigned to the feminine and demonized: our pleasure, our desires, our sexuality, our embodiment. And yes, our wealth, like holding wealth for doing this kind of spiritual work. Patriarchal religion really preaches this idea that this path of the spiritual path is a path of renunciation. Give up all your earthly goods, take a vow of poverty, no more sex, right? A path of leaving your body, getting up and out of your body, a path of seeing the divine through an authority outside of yourself, a path of, again, spiritual poverty. Like, if you're doing spiritual work, it has to be with poverty. Like, you have to be poor. You have to be experiencing poverty. And the spiritual practice of suffering to prove. Okay. So after I hosted the Mary Magdalene retreat back in 2023, which I am hosting it again this year, if you want to join us at the end of September, beginning of October in Southern France, you can go to themagneticwoman.com/luxury-retreat. Spots are extremely, extremely limited. It is the most incredible thing I've ever created. But anyways, after I hosted this retreat in 2023, I was in southern France and I went to Italy and I was in Florence and I was staying at an Airbnb next to a church. And it was Sunday morning and I hear mass going on. Again, being raised Catholic, going to Catholic school, Even though the Mass was happening in Italian and I am not fluent in Italian, I knew exactly where they were in the Mass because hashtag Catholic rituals, right? So I decide to take the sacred oil that I bought at Mary Magdalene's cave and do an anointing ritual and a self-pleasuring ritual. And as I'm doing the self-pleasuring ritual, I hear, your suffering is not the offering. It's your pleasure that is the offering. And so, this path of the sacred feminine, this Mary Magdalene lineage that is ironically, not ironically, resurrecting currently, is a path of reclamation. And it is a path of redefining what spiritual leadership is, redefining what embodied spirituality is, quite frankly, right? Because again, patriarchal religion will have you believe that being spiritual is about denying your body, up and out of your body. The sacred feminine is about down and into your body. It's the reclamation of the body as the portal for the divine. And what better way than pleasure? So just sit with that for a moment. What if suffering, sacrifice, denying yourself was not the offering? Because again, that's what we've been told, that you have to suffer to prove, that you have to sacrifice, that you have to give up. I mean, all of Lent is built upon this idea of 40 days of sacrifice, right? I don't know if you've ever seen the Da Vinci Code, but the like albino um monk that like flogs himself, right? And that was a very popular practice for a long time with Catholics and Christians. So, what if we did not see our suffering as the offering, but what if we saw our pleasure? What if we saw our happiness? What if we saw our sensuality as the offering to the divine, as the connection to the divine? What would change? So, this is why I think it's so, this is why I think so many women are drawn to working with Mary Magdalene right now. And this is why I think it's so important to work with Mary Magdalene right now. Okay? Because this, the patriarchal religions have been mixed in with colonization, white supremacy, extraction, lots of harm, right? I mean, how many places have been like settled to promote a certain Abrahamic religion? Which Abrahamic religions, if you don't know, are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, how many places have been settled, aka colonized, because of an Abrahamic religion? Under the guise of like, we're here to spread the good word, when really it's usually a power grab, it's a resource grab. So, as we like step into Easter weekend, as we think about the death and resurrection story that is everywhere, as we see so many people talking about Jesus, remember, one, he wouldn't be anything without Mary Magdalene. And two, the entire death and resurrection story is the story of the sacred feminine. And so, if you want to deepen your connection with Mary Magdalene, you want to really take a spiritual pilgrimage to her cave in southern France, I want to invite you to join me for the Mary Magdalene Luxury Retreat. So, when I first started working with Mary Magdalene, I heard about her cave and then I saw it in a meditation when she appeared to me and she led me to a cave that looked like a pussy. Fast forward like 6 months later, I'm listening to a podcast of Megan Waterston, who at the time was like the only person talking about Mary Magdalene. And she talked about the Cave of Eggs, which is this lesser known, or at that point, unknown cave in southern France that is shaped like a pussy. And I looked up a picture. It was the image that I saw in my meditation. I had never heard of it before. Okay. So I really wanted to take a pilgrimage to southern France and be in this energy. All I could find were pilgrimages of older women in muumuus, the very, I'm so spiritual, I don't really like wear makeup or deodorant or anything like that. And that's not a judgment, okay? And the accommodations were at like local monasteries or really like hostel type places where you're like sharing bathrooms, where it's like bare minimum. And I was like, okay, so you're telling me Mary Magdalene is this wealthy priestess. She's the one that bought the perfumed oils that anointed Jesus, and we're staying in a monastery with a shared bathroom. Like it to me, it was still this like path of struggle, path of sacrifice. I'm like, I can't, no, I can't. So finally, after a few years of searching for a retreat that I desired, I couldn't find it. So I created my own. We stayed a 5-star luxury resort. Okay. We take a trip to the pilgrimage to her cave. We spend our other time flirting with hot Frenchmen and drinking rosé and eating the most delicious food. We have a self-anointing ritual at a gorgeous hammam. We spend our time diving deep, embodying the ways of Mary Magdalene and doing it in luxury and abundance. So, if you want to join me, I would love to have you. If you have any questions about it, please feel free to message me on social media, on Instagram or on Facebook. And also, I'm creating a Mary Magdalene self-study course that will be out later in April. So if you're interested in that, the link is down below. You can pre-order it so that when it's available in the next few weeks, you'll just automatically get it. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. I'll see you next time.